Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. Today, we're going to begin a series of videos in which we're going to critique a volume put out by Dan Barker entitled Godless. And Barker was a former evangelist and gospel musician. He's now one of the leading atheists, and he's a co president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And the book Godless was published in 2008, and it begins by describing his intellectual journey away from the Christian faith. And then he launches into the reasons why he no longer believes in God. So what we're going to do is go through and take a look at the chapters where he talks about um, his various reasons for not believing in God, and refute each of those. And so we're going to begin today with chapter 6, where he talks about some of the major reasons that Christians, evangelical Christians, give for believing in God. And the first one, of course, is the argument from design. And he sums it up this way in his book, that the Christian argument is that how can you explain the complex order of the universe? I can't believe that the beauty of nature just happened by accident. Design requires a designer. And I would argue that that's the main reason why I believe in God. But basically, what happens is that Barker launches into a semantical discussion about, the definition of the universe, and is God a part of the universe, or did He create the universe, and are there multiverses? And then he argues the question. He deals with the question: did the designer have a did the designer have a designer? In other words, he tries to argue that if you're going to argue that the appearance of design means that the universe had to have had a designer, then that would mean that the designer would have had to have had a designer, and so on, infinitely back forward. And then he goes on to give the standard Darwinian argument that natural selection would create the appearance of design. In other words, the way natural selection works is that you have all these random mutations that take place. Most of them are not very beneficial at all, and so they just die out and disappear. So therefore, what survives are the ones that are very functional, and therefore, when you look at nature that exists today, it has the appearance of having been designed, even though, according to the Darwinists, it isn't really designed. Then he goes on to discuss a closely related argument, which is that of fine tuning, and he sums that up by saying the universe appears to be fine tuned for life. The odds against it all being various constants randomly falling into the narrow range required for life to exist are so astronomically high that it's virtually impossible for it to have happened by chance. There must have been a fine tuner of the universe. And that, of course, again, I think is closely related to the first one, a very, very excellent case in favor of the existence of God. Basically, he tries to Barker tries to refute that by drawing an argument from probability. And he says we don't know how many possibilities exist and what the statistical probability would be in what we see around us. So he talks about whether there were multiple big bangs and, multiverse. And so basically the argument on his part is that the way the law of probability would work is that if there were enough possibilities out there, eventually one of them would wind up being exactly the kind of thing that you see. Of course, the problem is that you have actually, it's pure speculation on his part, he has no way of knowing, how many other universes might exist out there, and therefore we just happen to live in the one that looks like it's very, very fine-tuned. Then there's the one from natural law, and he cites that one, and it looks like this. The universe is governed by natural laws. Laws require a lawgiver. There must be a divine governor. So in other words, you take a look at the fact that that everything in the universe seems to fall into a pattern. We call those natural laws, and therefore that would require some kind of a lawgiver. And then he tries to use something. It's a typical Barker. He gets involved in the semantics. And he argues that, well, there's a difference between prescriptive laws and descriptive laws, and what you see in nature would simply be a descriptive law, and therefore it doesn't require a lawgiver. And then he goes on to argue that if there was a lawgiver, then that would if the natural law requires a lawgiver, then that would mean the lawgiver would require an even higher lawgiver. And of course, the argument about that is that just because Congress passes law, it doesn't mean that there's a higher Congress that had to create the Congress. Okay, it's kind of a ridiculous argument. Then, of course, there's the argument from first cause, and just a second here. And it goes like this. Everything had a cause, and every cause is the effect of a previous cause. Something must have started it all. God, who exists outside of time and space, is the eternal first cause, the unmoved mover, the creator and remainder of the universe. And again, I think that's a very, very solid Christian argument, Christian theistic argument. Barker tries to get around that by saying, well, if everything has to have a cause, then God has to have a cause. And if God does not need a cause, then the universe does not need a cause. So, God's eternal. The universe could just be eternal. Okay. And so those are kind of the typical arguments. Now, there are other arguments that he tries to refute, and some of those really are weak arguments. Christians will point to the fact that they've experienced a new birth and had prayers answered and that kind of a thing. And if you're looking at it from just a purely apologetic standpoint, those arguments by themselves would be very, very hard to prove it. But I think that these various arguments about the complexity and the design and the structure and the order of the universe all point to are all solid arguments for a supreme being, an intelligent designer. Given the enormous complexity and functionality of the universe, all the evidence points to an intelligent designer. In other words, if you take a look at what you can actually observe in nature, in reality, what we know is that order does not spontaneously arise out of chaos. We know that life does not arise from non-life, or abiogenesis, as it's sometimes called. We know the species reproduce according to well-defined laws of heredity. Take a look at the experiments of Gregor Mendel and so on. That we notice the enormous complexity and functionality of nature. You take a look at just how complex the human body is. The other day I was taking a look at the Johns Hopkins Family Health book, and it is 1,657 pages long, and that's just describing the human body, with all the different kinds of blood cells and the circulatory system and so on, and that's just describing the human body. Then you got all the other plant and animal species out there, as well as all the other physical phenomena that goes on out there. The universe is just enormously complex. Sometimes people will say, that there is absolutely no proof of the existence of God. And I say nonsense. The proof of the existence of God is literally as plain as the nose on your face. Just look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, why is your face symmetrical? And then you take a look at all the animals out there. Why are their faces symmetrical? Why are your hands symmetrical? And, why did it come out that way? Did it all happen by happenstance? And, you're literally surrounded by proof of the existence of God. And it is true that there is such a thing as microevolution. You take a look at, the coronavirus, was able to mutate and evolve. But when you talk about a macroevolution where, the question is, did human beings evolve from apes? And where you're talking about these complex organ systems. And in order for that to be, in order for those kinds of mutations to successfully produce another species, you'd have to have multiple mutations simultaneous that are coordinated that would help produce a newly functional organ. And that would be virtually impossible. And then Barker has a series of arguments where he talks about if God is the first cause, then he does not need a cause. If God is the designer, he would need a designer, or he would. What he tries to argue is that if God is the first cause, then he would need a cause. If God is the designer, then he would need a designer. If God created natural law, then he would need a higher natural lawgiver. And the fact of the matter is, no. If God is the eternal creator of heaven and earth, then basically he doesn't need any of those things. And the point of it is this, that when we take a look at the universe as we can actually observe it today, it is obvious that it's got a structure, a complexity, a functionality that all points to the fact that somebody, some intelligent being, had to have designed it. And that is the God that we ought to be worshiping. So the majesty, the order, and complexity of the natural world should lead us to worship and adore the God who created it all. So we'll be going on in the weeks to come to discuss other parts of Barker's book and take it from there. So thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again. Bye.